She made me swear I'd never sell that lake house 3 days before she died. Weeks later I found the broker's card hidden on her porch. My own son had been planning to sell it for months, forging my signature while his mother was still warm in the ground. What he never saw coming was the trap she'd built into that deed a year before she got sick, waiting for exactly this moment. Welcome back to Dad's Cruel Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, because every villain in this story got exactly what they deserved. Be sure to subscribe and drop a comment. What would you have done in my place? My name is Robert Ellison. I'm 63 years old. I spent 38 years married to the only woman I ever loved, and I spent the last 3 months of her life keeping a promise I intended to take to my grave. The hospice room smelled like lavender and antiseptic, and the machines beeped in a rhythm I'd memorized by week 2. Margaret's hand was thinner than paper, but her grip still had strength when it mattered. Robert, she whispered, promise me. The lake house stays. I nodded, too tight for words. That house held 40 summers of our life, the dock where I taught our son to fish, the porch where she painted every June, the kitchen where 3 generations had eaten pancakes on Saturday mornings. It wasn't wood and shingles to her. It was proof that our life together had mattered. Promise me, she said again, weaker this time, no matter what David says. No matter what anyone says. I didn't ask why she specified our son by name. I should have. Instead I just said, I promise, Margaret. As long as I'm breathing, that house stays in this family. She smiled, the real one, the one I fell in love with in 1988, and closed her eyes. 3 days later, she was gone. At the funeral, David stood beside me in his black suit, hand on my shoulder, telling everyone how strong I was being. I believed him. I believed my son grieved the way I did, hollowed out, directionless, aching for the woman who held our family together. I didn't know grief wears different masks. Mine was silence. His, I'd learn, was arithmetic. While I was still finding her handwriting on grocery lists tucked in kitchen drawers, David was already running numbers on what that lake house could sell for. 6 weeks after the funeral, David invited himself over for dinner. He brought a bottle of wine and a rehearsed tone I didn't recognize on him. Dad, we need to talk about the house, he said, halfway through the meal. Which house? The lake house. I think it's time we talk about selling it. I set my fork down slowly. Your mother asked me not to sell that house. 3 days before she died. David's jaw tightened, just slightly, a tell I'd seen since he was 12 years old, lying about broken curfews. Dad, I get it, it's emotional. But it's also just sitting there. Property taxes, maintenance, insurance, that's real money bleeding out every month for a house nobody's even using. I use it, I said. I was there 2 weeks ago. Once. You went once. He leaned forward. Dad, I've got a broker friend. We could list it quietly, get top dollar before the market shifts. You wouldn't have to deal with any of the hassle. I studied my son's face and saw something that made my stomach drop, not concern for me, but calculation. David, I already told you. I made a promise to your mother. That house isn't for sale. Not now. Not ever, as long as I'm alive. He forced a smile, patted my hand the way you'd placate someone fragile. Sure, Dad. Of course. Forget I brought it up. But I didn't forget. Because I know my son, and I know when he's already decided something regardless of what I say. 3 weeks later, I found a business card in the mail slot of the lake house, not addressed to me, tucked half hidden under a flyer for gutter cleaning, like someone had meant to retrieve it and forgot. Marcus Bell, real estate broker, lakefront properties specialist. On the back, in handwriting I recognized instantly, David's. A note, call me when Dad's ready. Numbers still good. We can move fast on this one, that shoreline won't stay this price forever. I stood on that porch, holding the card, feeling something shift in my chest. Not sadness. Something colder. My son wasn't asking anymore. He was preparing. I drove home that night and didn't say a word to anyone. Instead, I opened the fireproof safe in my study, the one Margaret and I had filled over decades with insurance documents, our wills, and papers I hadn't fully looked through since the funeral. I needed to know exactly what I owned, and exactly what I didn't. What I found stopped me cold. A folder labeled Lake House Trust Documentation, dated 14 months before Margaret's diagnosis. Papers I didn't remember signing. A trust agreement, established quietly, naming a trustee. Not me. Not David. Someone else entirely, someone Margaret had trusted with something she never told either of us about. I sat there until 2 a.m., reading every page twice, understanding for the first time that my wife had protected that house long before she ever asked me to promise anything. The name on the trust documents was Diane Whitfield, Margaret's college roommate, a retired estate attorney I'd met maybe 5 times in 30 years. I called her the next morning, hands unsteady on the phone. "Robert," she said, voice careful. "I wondered when you'd call. You knew about this." "I drafted it," Diane said. "Margaret came to me 14 months before she got sick. She'd overheard David on the phone with a broker friend, talking about the lake house like it was already his inheritance to spend. She didn't want to believe it. But she wanted to be certain." My chest tightened. "She never told me. She didn't want to burden you with suspicion about your own son. She hoped she was wrong." Diane paused. "She wasn't wrong, was she?" I told her about the business card, the note, David's dinner conversation. Diane exhaled slowly. "Then you should know how the trust works. Margaret transferred the deed into an irrevocable trust. She named you as primary beneficiary with full rights to live there and use the property for the rest of your life. But the trust cannot be sold, transferred, or liquidated without trustee approval. And you're the trustee." "I am. Which means David can bring you 100 brokers, 100 offers, 100 lawyers. Legally, none of it matters unless I sign off. And Robert," her voice hardened slightly, "I have no intention of ever signing off, especially not now that I know what he's been planning." For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than grief. I felt Margaret's hand still on mine, still protecting our family from 6 feet under. David didn't let it go. 2 weeks after the dinner, he showed up unannounced with his wife, Kelly, and a folder of financial projections, spreadsheets showing the lake house's carrying costs versus its market value, color-coded like a corporate pitch. "Dad, look at these numbers objectively," Kelly said, sliding the folder toward me. "You're bleeding $4,000 a year on a property you visit twice a season." "It's not about the numbers," I said. David's composure cracked slightly. "Dad, Mom's gone. I know that hurts. But holding on to that house isn't honoring her memory, it's just avoiding reality." I almost laughed. My son, lecturing me about honoring his mother's memory, while quietly arranging her broker's card behind her back before her body was even cold in the ground. "I made her a promise," I said again, steady. "A promise made to a dying woman isn't a binding contract, Dad." David's voice rose. "It's grief talking. You need to think about your future, not some sentimental attachment to a lake house." Kelly added, gently, like she was coaching him, "We just think, financially, it makes sense to at least explore options." I looked between them, my son and his wife, dressed sharp, spreadsheets prepared, already speaking about my late wife's final wish in the past tense, like it was an obstacle to rot around rather than a promise to honor. "I've explored the options," I said calmly. "The house isn't for sale. It was never going to be for sale. And there's nothing you can do to change that." David's eyes narrowed, like he'd heard a challenge instead of a fact. He had no idea how right he was to feel uneasy. A month later, Diane called me, voice tight with controlled fury. "Robert, I need you to come to my office immediately." When I arrived, she slid a document across her desk, a power of attorney form, dated 2 weeks earlier, purporting to grant David authority over my financial and property decisions due to diminished capacity following the loss of my spouse. My signature was on it. Except I'd never signed it. "Where did this come from?" I asked, my hands trembling for the first time in this entire ordeal. "David's attorney sent it to my office, requesting the trust release the property based on this POA," Diane said. He assumed, correctly, that I'd need to verify authority before considering any request. What he didn't count on was me knowing your actual signature after 40 years of paperwork with Margaret. She pointed to 3 inconsistencies: the pressure of the pen, a missing loop in my R, the date formatted in a way I never use. This is forged, Robert. Not sloppily. Someone studied your signature. Someone who had access to old documents in your house. My stomach turned. David had been in our house dozens of times since the funeral, helping sort through Mom's things. He'd had access to everything: old letters, documents, contracts, my actual signature on 100 pieces of paper. What happens now? I asked. Diane's expression turned grim and focused. Now, we don't confront him quietly. Now we build a case. Forged power of attorney used to attempt seizure of trust property is not a family disagreement, Robert. It's a crime. For the first time, I understood this wasn't going to end with a conversation. It was going to end with consequences. Diane moved fast. She subpoenaed the notary who'd allegedly witnessed my signature, a woman named Rhonda Pierce, who worked at a shipping store 2 towns over, a notary I had never met in my life. When Diane's investigator interviewed her, Rhonda admitted, nervously, that a man matching David's description had come in with an older woman claiming to be his father's companion, presenting an ID that wasn't checked closely enough. Rhonda had stamped the document based on assurance, not verification, a mistake that could cost her her license. We had our first solid thread. Diane pulled the store's security footage before it cycled out. Grainy, but unmistakable, David, in his gray peacoat, and a woman I didn't recognize, standing at that counter, presenting documents. Who's the woman? I asked. Diane zoomed in. I don't know yet. But I intend to find out. It took her investigator 4 days. The woman was Marcus Bell's assistant, the broker whose business card I'd found on the lake house porch. David hadn't just been planning to sell the house. He'd orchestrated an entire scheme, forged the POA, presented to the trustee, used the broker's team to rush a sale before anyone could verify anything, and pocketed a commission-sharing kickback Marcus had apparently promised him for delivering lakefront property off-market. I sat in Diane's office reading the printed emails between David and Marcus, casual, confident, treating my dead wife's final wish like a business transaction to be closed quickly before anyone asked too many questions. He wasn't just impatient, I said quietly. He planned this before she even died. Diane didn't answer. She didn't need to. The emails were dated 8 months before Margaret's death. I invited David to the lake house, his choice of location, ironic as it was. He arrived expecting another negotiation. Instead, he found Diane already seated at the kitchen table, a folder in front of her, and me standing by the window his mother used to paint from. What's this? David asked, forced casual, though I could see his eyes catch the folder immediately. Sit down, David, I said. Diane opened the folder and slid across copies of the forged POA, the notary statement, the security footage stills, and the emails between him and Marcus Bell. David's face drained of color in real time. Dad, I can explain. You forged my signature, I said, voice steady, cold in a way I didn't know I had in me. You used a corrupt notary to certify it. You conspired with a broker to sell your mother's lake house behind my back, months before she even died, and you split a commission for doing it. It's not what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like. I leaned forward. Your mother knew, David. She knew what you were planning before she was even diagnosed. That's why she put this house into an irrevocable trust 14 months before she got sick. That's why she made me promise on her deathbed, because she knew you'd try this, and she wanted me to have every legal weapon necessary to stop you. David's composure finally shattered. She didn't trust me? She trusted you completely, I said. Until she heard you on the phone with your broker friend, talking about this house like it was already yours to sell. Diane didn't wait for David to recover. Within the week, she filed a formal complaint: forgery, attempted fraud, and conspiracy to defraud a trust, naming David, the notary Rhonda Pierce, and broker Marcus Bell as co-conspirators. The DA's office moved surprisingly fast once the forged POA and falsified notarization were confirmed. Rhonda, terrified of losing her license and facing charges, cooperated fully, providing a signed statement detailing exactly how David had approached her and what he'd promised her in exchange for looking the other way. Marcus, realizing his broker's license was now in jeopardy, threw David under immediately, producing every email, every text, every planning document that proved this wasn't a rash decision made in grief. It was calculated, sustained, and deliberate, spanning nearly a year. David hired a lawyer, of course. But forged signatures notarized by a bribed official don't leave much room for legal maneuvering. His attorney's first move was negotiating a plea rather than fighting the charges outright, a clear signal of how weak his position actually was. The final agreement, David pled guilty to attempted fraud, avoided prison through a combination of probation, restitution, and mandatory financial counseling, but the conviction stayed permanently on his record. His broker's license application, the one he'd been quietly pursuing for over a year, hoping to go into business with Marcus, was denied outright once the fraud conviction surfaced. Everything he'd built toward, every angle he'd worked, collapsed in the span of 6 months. And the lake house, the one he'd tried to steal, remained exactly where his mother had placed it, untouched, protected, permanently out of his reach. The fallout didn't stop with David. Kelly, his wife, had been present for the spreadsheet pitch, the pressure campaign, the calculated conversations about exploring options. When the fraud investigation became public within our small town, she distanced herself immediately, telling anyone who'd listen that she had no idea what David was actually planning. But Diane's investigator had pulled phone records during discovery, records showing Kelly had exchanged over 60 texts with Marcus Bell's assistant in the 2 months before the forged POA surfaced, coordinating logistics for what she called the transition. When confronted with the records during David's legal proceedings, Kelly's claims of ignorance evaporated. She filed for divorce 3 months later, taking their 2 children and relocating 2 states away, unable to face the humiliation that had settled over our small community once the story got out. David, convicted, divorced, and denied his broker's license, was left standing in the wreckage of a scheme he'd started planning before his own mother's body was cold. He'd wanted a lake house. Instead, he lost his family, his reputation, and any trust one might have eventually rebuilt with him. I watched all of this unfold with a strange, hollow calm. Margaret had asked me to protect one thing, a house full of memories. I hadn't expected protecting it would also mean watching my son destroy everything else around him in the attempt to take it. But I understood something by then. Margaret hadn't just been protecting a house. She'd been protecting the truth about who our son really was, a truth she'd discovered 8 months before she died, and one she trusted me to face without her. Thanksgiving came 5 months after David's conviction. I set the table at the lake house the way Margaret always had, her good china, her linen napkins folded the way she'd taught me, candles lit even though it was still daylight. David wasn't invited. Not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to invite him to. Our relationship, the one that had survived 30 years of ordinary father-son friction, hadn't survived this. Some betrayals don't heal with time. They just calcify into permanent distance. I sat at that table alone, looking at the empty chairs where David, Kelly, and their kids used to sit, and I thought about the last conversation I'd had with Margaret. She hadn't just asked me to save a house. She'd asked me to be strong enough to see our son clearly, even when it broke my heart to do it. I poured a glass of wine and raised it toward the empty seats. I kept my promise, Margaret, I said quietly to the empty room. The house is safe. I just wish it hadn't cost us everything else. Outside, the lake was still and dark, exactly the way it had been every autumn for 40 years. The dock where I taught David to fish sat empty in the moonlight. I wondered if he ever thought about that dock now, or if all he remembered was the commission he never collected. A year later, I still spend my summers at the lake house, exactly as Margaret asked. I've started painting on that porch, badly, using her old brushes and half-empty tubes of paint she never finished using. It's not talent. It's connection, a way to keep something of her alive in the space she loved most. Diane still manages the trust, though these days our calls are more friendship than business. She tells me sometimes that Margaret was the sharpest client she ever had, that most people don't have the foresight to protect what they love from the people who claim to love them too. David reached out once, nearly a year after everything collapsed, a short email asking if we could talk. I read it twice, then closed my laptop without responding. Some promises are meant to protect the people we love. Others are meant to protect us from the people who stopped deserving our trust long before we were ready to admit it. The lake house still stands, untouched, exactly where Margaret left it, a monument not just to 40 years of marriage, but to a woman who saw through her own son's ambition long before anyone else was willing to. I kept my promise to her. And in doing so, I learned the difference between grief and betrayal, and how rarely they announce themselves as clearly as we wish they would. The dock is still there. The water is still calm. And every summer, I sit on that porch, and I remember exactly why she asked me to protect it, not because it was valuable, but because it was ours. Module 12, What Remains. A year later, I still spend my summers at the lake house, exactly as Margaret asked. I've started painting on that porch, badly, using her old brushes and half-empty tubes of paint she never finished using. It's not talent. It's connection, a way to keep something of her alive in the space she loved most. Diane still manages the trust, though these days our calls are more friendship than business. She tells me sometimes that Margaret was the sharpest clientess.